So I want to welcome you all to ISTC today. For those who are new here, my name's Nancy Holm. I'm the Sponsored Research Coordinator and Seminar Organizer. This is our last seminar in our sustainability series this spring. The series has focused on social science aspects of sustainability and climate change. These talks were meant to give us another perspective on environmental issues. We faced to learn that understanding and finding solutions to questions about how to adapt to climate change, how to determine impacts, and the best ways to identify more sustainable systems required that we look beyond the natural and physical sciences that we usually discuss here. We also need to incorporate the humanities and social sciences as we move forward to address these issues. So we're very pleased today to have with us Dr. James Salley from the University of Chicago, who will be giving a talk on the economic perspective on fuel economy policy. Dr. Salley is an assistant professor at the Harris School of Public Policy Studies and a faculty research fellow of the National Bureau of Economic Research. In 2010, he was a visiting researcher at the University of California Energy Institute. His research spans a variety of topics in public economics, including the economics of taxation and environmental economics. His current research is focused on evaluating policy alternatives for increasing fuel economy of new vehicles in the U.S. This research includes studies of how automobile producers respond to fuel economy standards and tax incentives and studies of how consumer demand for fuel economy responds to gasoline prices and consumer beliefs about future gasoline prices. Dr. Salley teaches courses on policy approaches to mitigating climate change, UX tax policy, and empirical methods at the Harris School at the University of Chicago. He was the 2008 recipient of the National Tax Association Dissertation Award and 2009 recipient of the John V. Krutila Research Award. He completed his PhD in economics at the University of Michigan in 2008, and he holds a BA in economics and political science from Macalester College. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Salley.
First, let me just say thanks very much for having me, and thanks to Nancy, who can't hear me thanking her, for organizing my visit. It's a pleasure to come down. As Nancy indicated, I'm an economist, and my research is focused on trying to understand the costs and benefits of fuel economy policy, of the ways that we try to get reductions in gasoline consumption, improvements in fuel economy, and in the longer run shifts towards non-petroleum, potentially based sources of energy for transportation. And as an economist, we tend to rely on very simple mechanisms and rely on the market to solve problems, and that's going to be reflected in what I present today. So I want to, in reality, is often a little bit more complicated than what an economist writes down, and I understand that, but the goal today is to give you sort of the very basic canonical treatment from an economist point of view of how we think about this particular problem. And so also as an economist, I'll say three things about being an economist. So that was the first. The second is you should feel free to interrupt me. We are sort of an abrasive group, and I'm very used to being interrupted while I speak. So if you want to ask questions now, I'll try to save time at the end to field questions, but you should feel free to interrupt, especially if it's a clarifying question throughout. The third thing about being an economist is that, as is typical, I will spend a lot of my time thinking about and talking about efficiency today. And what we mean and what I want to get out of efficiency in fuel economy policy is that I want to not only get some X percentage reduction in gasoline consumed or some Y percentage increase in fuel economy in the fleet, but I want to get that in a way that's least costly to society. And what that means is that I need to make sure that the people for whom it is cheapest to make those reductions in gasoline or improvements in fuel economy are the people in the economy that actually take that action. And the second thing that we need to think about for efficiency, and I'll highlight today, are that we need to limit the unintended consequences of the policy instruments that we're using. And so that's what we have. What's what I have in mind when I sit down to think about policy design in this area. So the goal of my talk today is to just give you a sense of how an economist thinks about this particular area, and I'll sort of first try to motivate why the things I research are interesting to me and why I think they're important and hope they're interesting to you, and then sketch out what the basic economist solution to a fuel economy or gasoline or transportation externality problem would be, so we have some sense of what an economist thinks the ideal looks like. And then the third thing will actually be to discuss how the ideal compares to what we actually do. So to discuss what does fuel economy policy actually look like, and you won't be surprised, the fuel economy policy we actually use is significantly different from the theoretical ideal, and I'll take some pains to describe why that's important and the degree to which it is important. So I like to start off with simple statements that I think I can back up. And so I'm going to try to build the motivation for this talk in a couple of simple steps. The first is that there are, in fact, a lot of cars. And second, that cars, each car creates a significant amount of what we call negative externalities. So these are impacts from one person driving their car around that impacts other people that go unpriced in the market. And they come from several sources. There are several things that cars do that are important and motivate public policy. The first is that they consume lots of energy. So you may just care inherently about how much the United States, for example, consumes in terms of gasoline or BTUs or some other metric because you think it has direct import for national security interests or other matters. Second, because they consume lots of gasoline, cars emit a substantial amount of greenhouse gases. And so if you are interested in climate change, then this is quite important. A third thing, which I suspect the first two are quite familiar to everyone here. The third one, which will not surprise anyone but is often neglected in these types of policy discussions, is that cars also create congestion and cause accidents. So when I drive around in my car, the fact that I may be risking accident myself, presumably is something that I consider and take into account when I drive around and I choose how to drive. But the fact that I'm increasing the probability that other people are going to get into an accident is something that I will not take into account in a standard model, and therefore constitutes an accident. Okay, so the fact that there are these types of externalities that are related to fuel consumption, but there are also externalities related to just driving around per mile driven, is actually going to turn out to be critical for evaluating the types of policies we do in this country. And so I say that sort of the case is closed. Now we need public policy. So I teach at a public policy school. I study public economics, which basically means I study when markets fail and they need some help. So it's easy for me I get excited when we can make a simple case for policy intervention in the market. So what I want to talk about now is, or throughout the talk, is sort of given that we believe this policy is warranted because there are the market will not provide optimal outcomes once these externalities are taken into consideration. We need public policy. What should that look like and what does it look like? So let me actually go through those statements I just made one at a time now. The first is that there are a lot of cars. So that doesn't surprise you. In the United States in particular, there are a lot of cars. And one fact I like having at my disposal is the fact that as of around 1970, the number of registered vehicles, which is this green line, actually caught up with the number of licensed drivers. Okay, so as of the early 70s, we had at least one car per licensed driver, and we're now up to around 1.2 registered vehicles. So these don't even count sort of junked vehicles that are laying around somewhere. These are registered vehicles that are maintained. We've got about 1.2 of them per licensed driver. And this is now representing a very large fraction of the population as well. So we have about 0.8 vehicles per capita, including people that are too young to drive. In the the United States is an outlier relative to other countries in a certain respect, which is that the United States is plotted up here in this diagram, which I took from the IPCC, which shows on the Y vertical axis here the number of vehicles owned per 1,000 persons, and then on the x-axis here shows the GDP per capita. So this is showing the relationship between wealth and vehicle ownership across a number of countries. I find this to be a wonderful figure because it shows you two types of relationships all in one diagram. The first is that each country has a number of dots representing different years of data. And what you can see for the most part is that if you pick any country and you look at the relationship, even within country, there's a clear gradient between wealth per capita and vehicle ownership. So as the United States gets wealthier over time, there's an increase in the number of vehicles. The same thing is true for almost all of the countries with data in this figure. And the second is that it shows that correlation also across countries, so which is the striking part of the figure. The very, very strong upward slope here shows the cross-country relationship between wealth and vehicle ownership. Okay, so the United States, as we know, has the most cars. And in one sense, it's an outlier in that it is the wealthiest country and has the most cars, and sort of a very high point of the diagram. In another sense, it's not an outlier in the sense that the relationship, if we drew a regression line through here, the United States would be above the regression line, but it would not be dramatically so. The relationship we see seems to extrapolate. Why is this important? Well, it's important. There are lots of cars in the world, but what this diagram is suggesting is that as the wealth in the global economy grows, we can expect many, many more cars because there's this very strong historical relationship between income and vehicle ownership, which implies all of the sort of negative externalities that come with it. And then to finish this motivation, I'll just point out that these two data points right here are India and China. So India and China are right here with something on the order of 20 or 30 cars per 1,000 persons, as opposed to the United States, which is in the 800s. I do not know. So we may have a data error, or I don't know. I should maybe track down what year this was and find out. I don't know. Okay.
I'm curious. Everything we see and read about India and China is congestion of traffic in the same way with Mexico City. Yet per capita, it's very low. Is it an urban design issue and related to the amount of roads?
I suspect the answer is yes. But I would not. I don't know. But yes. So I would suggest that this diagram would tell you that those problems we should expect to get much, much worse before they get better. But that's my takeaway from it. Okay, so there are lots of cars, and there are going to be lots more cars. And so if they are causing social damage, we need to pay attention to them, and we need to figure out what policy measures work for sort of controlling that growth or mitigating the impacts from them. The second thing is cars create lots of pollution, both greenhouse gases and local air pollution. And so just so we have these ballpark numbers in our mind, personal transportation, so not commercial transportation, not medium and heavy-duty trucks or barges or airplanes or rail, consume about 50% of the petroleum in the United States is for personal transportation. It's for us driving around in our cars, not for moving goods around the country. So it's about half of our petroleum use, and it's about 20% of all of our greenhouse gases come from personal transportation moving around. So total transportation is a bigger share of greenhouse gases, but just us driving our cars around to get to and from work is a very large greenhouse gas component. Cars also create lots of accidents and are actually one of a significant cause of death in the United States, which is going to get back to that second type of externality, which is related not to the emissions, but to the driving. So just to illustrate this point, I pulled one thing, which was the CDC's list of leading causes of death in 2007. And what you see is that we've got some major illnesses: heart disease, cancer, respiratory diseases, Alzheimer's, diabetes. The other thing on this list, and these are listed in order of the main categories, are accidents. The leading category in accidents are actually motor vehicle accidents. And of course, this dramatically understates the sort of person years lost to the mortality, because the average age of someone who dies in an automobile accident is in the 30s, whereas someone who dies from these other illnesses is much, much older on average. So this, in some sense, understates the mortality impact of vehicles. But this is a substantial cost to vehicles. I don't have a slide for congestion, but in certain parts of the country, the congestion costs of adding another vehicle to a road when people are trying to get to work, I experienced this on my way down from Chicago this morning, is quite substantial. And the time cost and the value to the economy from that externality can be quite large. So that's the end of my motivation, and I hope if you weren't already motivated to think that automobile policy was important, I hope you'll go along with me now. So I want to move now to talking in sort of the simplest terms about the theoretical ideal for solving such problems that we would present in a standard economics course or in an economics textbook. And that starts with drawing a supply and demand graph, which is how we solve all of our problems in economics, and understanding that. So I've drawn here the market for gasoline. I'm going to focus on one type of externality for now. And in this market for gasoline, we have a marginal cost curve, which we could also just call the supply curve. And we've got a downward sloping demand curve for gasoline. So as the price of gasoline rises, demand falls, and so on. And the black lines in this diagram are the things that are relevant for private individuals making decisions without respect to social costs and benefits. And so what happens in a market equilibrium is where supply meets demand is our outcome. And so that says that we would get what I've labeled here as Q2, quantity of goods. The way we think about externalities in simplest terms is to say that a negative production externality, as an example, is one in which the producer of the good, the maker of gasoline, fails to recognize the full cost of gasoline because they're not paying for some of those costs. So if those costs are greenhouse gases or local air pollution or energy security, then we just say the supplier is failing to realize that those costs exist. And so what we would like to do is include all of those costs, which we would call the social marginal cost. I've drawn here in red the difference between what the firm actually acknowledges as a cost and the full cost to society is the externality. So the gap between those two lines is what we call the externality in dollar terms from gasoline. Okay? So if we recognize the full cost of gasoline, including not just the private cost the firm incurs to produce and to buy and refine and distribute gasoline, but also the consequent impacts on society, then we would realize that the full cost is much higher. And what we would like to do is actually locate where the full social cost intersects with demand, which is quantity Q1. So to an economist, we have an externality. We have a simple problem. We can just rephrase it as we need to get our society to consume Q1 quantity of gasoline instead of Q2. So how do we do that? We also have a simple solution for how we do that, which is usually called a Pigouvian tax after an economist, A.C. Pigou, who originally showed the formulas for solving this problem all the way back in 1912 in an important article. And what he showed is that if we had a tax of a certain size, which happens to be equal to the size of the externality at the optimal quantity, if we imposed a tax on that market so that producers who are making gasoline face a higher cost because they have to pay not just their private costs for buying the gasoline, refining it, and distributing it, but also they must pay a tax to the government, then we can get them to behave as if they are recognizing the full cost to society of gasoline. Okay? So if we can impose a tax in the market for gasoline, and we can make that tax the right size, then the private market will deliver us Q1 units of output because the firms will act as if their costs are higher. Okay. What's important about this policy solution to an economist is that everyone in the market, if we had a tax that everyone had to pay who was selling gasoline, everyone in the market would face the same incentive to reduce or their gasoline production. Everyone would face the same marginal price for gasoline. If people who consume gasoline in the market found that doing something else, abating somehow, either by conserving or switching to another source of energy, find it cheaper than paying the new higher price for gasoline, then they will do so. And people who find it more expensive to change their behavior will not change their behavior, but will instead pay the higher price for gasoline. And that is efficient. And what's important for market efficiency is that everyone face that same change in incentive from the policy. That's where we get efficiency. Okay? So this ideal simple Pigouvian tax that I've outlined is a tax directly on either the externality or the good one-for-one on a good that produces an externality. So in terms of the externalities I talked about before, a tax on gasoline is actually a very good tax for if you're worried about energy consumption for national security reasons. If you're worried about the greenhouse gas content in gasoline, it's also directly taxing gasoline is a very efficient mechanism. If you're worried about local air pollution, then you actually need to tax not just gasoline, but you need to tax gasoline interacted with issues about local conditions which dictate the damages from polluting in a particular area. And importantly, congestion and accidents, actually, the Pigouvian tax is not a tax on gasoline for congestion and accidents. Instead, it's a tax on miles driven, or a tax on miles driven interacted with driving conditions. So economists will sometimes talk about real-time congestion pricing, real-time tolling, where the price for driving on a particular road or into a city center depends on how congested the city center is and can change throughout the time of day. We have this in operation in only a couple of places, London, Singapore, but that's the ideal. Okay. So a tax, in the end, a tax on gasoline is actually a pretty good approximation for directly taxing the externalities in most of these cases, with the exception of it's an imperfect way of taxing congestion and accidents. And a tax on gasoline plus separately a different tax on driving additional miles, on miles driven, is very, very close to the ideal, although it's not perfect, but studies have shown that the deviation from a perfect policy to just a tax on gasoline plus a tax on congestion is very minor. So what, according to economists, what is the optimal tax on gasoline given all of these externalities and the size of these externalities? How big should the Pigouvian tax be? Well, one answer comes from a paper by Perry and Small, who account for all of these things we just discussed and come up with the answer that in the United States, the optimal tax on gasoline should be $1 a gallon. Okay? So what do we actually do? Actually, we tax about 40 cents a gallon on average. Only about 18.5 cents of that comes from the federal government. The rest is from state and local, so there's variation in the size of that tax. But on average, it's about 40 cents a gallon. And importantly, the 40 cents a gallon is actually being used not to correct for these externalities, but is actually being used to raise revenue. And so the government has independently decided there's a reason to tax gasoline because it wants to pay for highways and other things, which of course is the fact that we use it, the federal money is earmarked for the highway fund is a great irony if you're worried about taxing gasoline for environmental purposes. But that's an aside. But standard public finance theory would tell you that the answer is that if the externality tax should be $1 and we already have 40 cents, but the 40 cents is based on raising revenue, we should actually add a full another $1. It's not that we're 60 cents too low. It's that we should actually have a $1.40 tax if we're valuing the revenue as well. Okay? So this is what an economist says we should do. What do we actually do? Well, as I said, we do have a gasoline tax, but it's not designed to correct for externalities. Instead, it's designed to raise revenue, which is also an important thing the governments do. Instead, when we're actually when we're enacting policies in the United States that are motivated by environmental or energy concerns, what we've typically done is actually focus on fuel economy, not gasoline. Okay, so we've actually taxed and regulated or subsidized fuel economy, which turns out to be something considerably different from what I just described. Okay, so the most important fuel economy policy in the United States, as many of you probably know, are the CAFE standards, the Corporate Average Fuel Economy Standards, which took effect starting in 1978 and phased in over the next decade and a half and have been flat until very recently. What they require is that each automaker every year must maintain some average minimum fleet fuel efficiency across all of the cars that they sell in order to meet the standard. And if they don't meet the standard, there's a penalty structure in place. Importantly, CAFE standards treat light trucks and cars as separate entities. Okay, I'm going to talk about this more going forward. So I like to say that CAFE works with quotation marks around it in the following sense. This graph shows you, starting back in 1978 through to today, the actual fuel economy standard, the CAFE standard for domestic cars and for light trucks in the solid black lines. The dashed lines that are sort of dancing about those are the actual fleet fuel economies for cars and light trucks separately. And then along the bottom for reference is the retail gasoline price on another scale. Okay? So what this shows you is that back when the policy was introduced, average fuel economy ratings were in the teens, and that as the fuel economy regulation phased in, the fuel economy of the fleet followed it closely, and then once and rose significantly, and then once it was phased in and the fuel economy standard leveled off, then pretty much fuel economy in the fleet leveled off until the last few years in the 2000s when gas prices were very high, and then we see an increase in fuel economy rising on its own without the standard for cars. Yep.
If I look at the last 10 years or so, or 15 years, the graphs look fairly continuous. So I don't see the impact of any hybrid vehicles.
So hybrid vehicles really weren't on the market 15 years ago. So it's a much shorter. It's more like 10 since the Prius might have been 02 or 03. So there's a couple of. So we do see since the last 4 years, when there's actually a substantial amount of hybrids, there is an increase in the cars. There is also an increase in the trucks, although the standard is also increasing. But hybrid vehicles remain a very small fraction of the fleet, a couple of percent even now. So, okay. So another sense in which CAFE works is actually if you look at the vehicle miles traveled and the gasoline consumed. So how much gasoline are we consuming relative to how much are we driving around in the country, where the time series are each normalized so that 1960 is equal to 1. Okay, so you can see the proportional increases along the vertical axis. And what you see is that prior to 1978, when CAFE took effect, basically a move in vehicle miles traveled was equivalent to a move in gasoline consumed, okay, because they were essentially the same thing. And then once CAFE was introduced, there's actually a break between these two concepts. So because fuel economy is changing, we can drive more, and the increase in gasoline is less than the increase in our vehicle miles traveled. And you can see here the recession, okay, which is the only drop in vehicle miles traveled in the last several decades. Okay, so CAFE works, but I like to say CAFE works, but CAFE sucks, in the sense that we've achieved, through CAFE, an increase in fuel economy of vehicles, but it's not efficient in the way that I sort of prefaced all the way back at the beginning of the talk and tried to highlight when we talked about the Pigouvian tax. And there's three main reasons why CAFE is not efficient in that sense. The first is that it does not actually create a uniform incentive across all of the automakers for improving fuel economy. So the reason is that it's just simply a minimum standard. So a number of automobile makers, basically the Asian car companies, so Toyota, Honda, and the other smaller companies, all have average fuel economies that are well above the standard. As a result, the fact that the standard exists is irrelevant to them. It's not binding on them. Their behavior is not being influenced. In the end, it means the existence of the regulation gives them no incentive to improve their fuel economy. And it may be the case that even relative to the relatively efficient cars that Toyota and Honda sell, if they were incentivized, it might be cheaper for them to improve their fuel economy than it is for GM, Ford, and Chrysler. Okay? But actually, the CAFE policy is only incentivizing GM, Ford, and Chrysler. Okay? It's actually also incentivizing the Europeans, but it turns out they don't meet the standard by and large. They just pay fines. Okay? So the people that are actually being sort of moved by the standard are basically the big three. Okay? It's also the case that the incentive is uneven across passenger cars and light trucks because we're treating them as separate, unrelated markets. Okay? And this actually matters a great deal, as I'll talk about at the end. The second thing, and this is the one that economists typically focus on, is that what a CAFE standard does is it raises the fuel economy of a vehicle without changing the price of gasoline. What consumers care about is the cost of driving a mile. Consumers don't actually consume gasoline, so the price of gasoline is not particularly relevant. What's relevant is how much does it cost for me to drive my car. So what happens is the cost for me to drive my car is equal to the price of gasoline divided by my fuel economy. So when I raise the fuel economy without changing the price of gasoline, I actually lower the cost of driving on the margin. And what we expect happens, and what we have measurements of this, is that when we lower the cost of driving, people drive more, as you might expect. As a result, as compared to a gas tax, fuel economy regulation, a CAFE standard, lowers the cost of driving and causes people to drive a little bit more. This is important for two reasons. First, it erodes some of the gasoline savings that you got on the order of about 10%. That's what we think we lose about 10% of the gasoline. But just as importantly, that actually raises externalities related to driving around. So our congestion externalities, our accident externalities, actually get worse as a result of adding in the CAFE standard. Okay? So the net impact of the CAFE standard comes from balancing improvements in greenhouse gases, local air pollution, and energy security against the increased cost of congestion and accidents because we're actually making those things worse. We sometimes call this the rebound effect. The third thing that CAFE does that's inefficient as compared to a gasoline tax is it actually only affects the new car market directly. Okay? And so when I change the corporate average fuel economy standard now, as we've recently done in the government, this will impact new cars, but it has no impact on the used cars that are driving around. It takes around 14 years to cycle through the stock of the stock of vehicles in the fleet, and so the impact of regulation takes a much longer time to filter through the economy. If I raise the price of gasoline, then the miles driven decision and the decision to scrap inefficient versus efficient cars at the end of their life is affected immediately for used cars as well as for new cars. Okay? So as a result, when we account for all of these differences, the efficiency impact of fuel economy regulation compared to a gasoline tax turns out to be quite large. So a standard estimate, well, there's a variety of numbers out there, but this is an often cited one by Austin and Dinan, estimates that to achieve the same quantity reduction in gasoline consumed in the United States over a 14-year period, the CAFE policy costs, in terms of welfare, lost value to consumers and firms 50% more than the equivalent gasoline tax. Okay? So that number, I wouldn't stake my life on 50% being right, but every estimate I've ever seen suggests that it's large, that this magnitude is significant. Okay? So some people, and this is controversial, and I actually happen to know that the authors are a little bit uncomfortable with this finding themselves, actually find when they try to value the fuel economy, the gasoline consumed externalities and balance them against the accident and congestion externalities, they find that the increasing CAFE standards from their current level actually decreases social welfare on average. Okay? And that's because their best estimates are that the congestion and accident externalities are actually outweigh the greenhouse gas and national security externalities given the location of current policy. Okay? And I have to say, so this is I know these authors quite well, and I know that they actually don't like this result. They're very uncomfortable with it, which I think is partly telling that that's how their numbers came out. And I actually have a research with a co-author which examines the loophole for ethanol flexible fuel vehicles and the corporate average fuel economy standard. And we show there's actually a way of measuring the cost to firms of these CAFE policies by studying how much they're willing to use this loophole. The quick summary of the loophole is that vehicles that are made into flexible fuel vehicles can run on regular gasoline, but they can also run on high blend ethanol E85. And the government, to get people to build these things, give a very large bonus to vehicles that are flex fuel capable in terms of their CAFE treatment. So in the end, what happens is if you built a flexible fuel Hummer, which does not exist, by the way, but if you did, it would actually be rated for CAFE purposes equivalent to a 6-cylinder Camry. Okay, so the bonus in the policy is quite large, and we show that you can actually figure out how much CAFE is costing the firm in lost profits by looking at an optimization model, by studying how much they use this loophole. And we find that the cost of CAFE in terms of lost profits for corporations are actually much lower than the corporations claim and that some other research finds. But even when we we plug in our very low lost profit numbers into a cost-benefit analysis from the Perry et al. Paper, we still find, using those numbers, that the social impact of increasing CAFE standards is actually negative. Okay, so we know what the optimal tax on gasoline would be a significant increase, but it's unclear. I would phrase it as it's unclear whether or not increasing fuel economy regulation is actually a good thing. So all of us would advocate strongly a large gas tax, but we're a little bit uncomfortable about how a fuel economy regulation change would net out. So the other thing we do, in addition to fuel economy regulation, is that we also target fuel economy through taxation of different forms. So we tax very inefficient passenger cars through something called the gas guzzler tax. We subsidize efficient cars through hybrid vehicle tax credits, of which I'm a beneficiary, so I'm grateful on a personal level. And there are a variety of state subsidies that have done the same thing. There have been a wide range of hybrid incentives by state and local governments. The Canadian government has a policy that looks just like this. It taxes inefficient cars. It subsidizes efficient cars as a way to get people to buy more efficient vehicles. The scrappage subsidies, like the Cash for Clunkers bill, actually had built into it the exact same kind of thing, where people could get a bigger rebate if they had a more efficient new car and were trading in a less efficient vehicle. Okay, so in the end, and some people have talked about sort of fee-bates, which are these combined hybrid tax rebate programs, as being a new policy solution that would overcome some of the criticism of CAFE standards. But it turns out that these fuel economy taxations actually have all the exact same problems as CAFE. So far, historically, they've all treated light trucks and cars differently, and they cause the rebound effect in the same way, which is that they don't actually change the price of gasoline, so it lowers the cost of driving, just as a CAFE policy does. And it also only directly impacts the new car market. So all of the relative inefficiencies compared to fuel taxation apply also to fuel economy taxation. Okay? It's also the case that all of these policies feature something that I call notches. Okay? So here's the best way to describe what I mean by notches is to look at the tax schedule in the United States for the gas guzzler tax. So it turns out, many of you probably don't know this because it turns out that it ends up being relatively obscure. If you have a really, really inefficient passenger car, not a light truck, passenger car in the United States, if it gets less than 12.5 miles per gallon, you actually pay a $7,700 tax on the car when you buy it. Okay? If it gets less than 12.49 miles per gallon, then you pay $7,700 tax. But if it gets 12.5 miles per gallon, then you only pay a $6,200 tax. So you can save hundreds of dollars by making a tiny improvement in fuel economy. Okay? So what a co-author and I have done is actually study the distribution of vehicle fuel economies around these discontinuous points to study whether or not the automakers respond to these discrete changes in their tax treatment that they can get for making very marginal improvements in fuel economy. The reason that this kind of a behavioral response that I'm describing is inefficient is that vehicles that are located a mile per gallon away from one of these discontinuities have no incentive to improve their fuel economy on the margin. And vehicles that are located very, very close to one of these policies have extremely large per mile per gallon incentives for making fuel economy improvements. So again, compared to what I described of efficiency, meaning that everyone in an economy faces the same incentives, this creates varying incentives so that some people are facing an incentive to improve and some are not. So this is a histogram of the actual distribution of fuel economy ratings in the range of passenger cars that are affected by this gas guzzler tax. Now, at every blue bar is a 0.1 mile per gallon in which, let me just try to say that again. We've highlighted all of the blue and red bars are the ones that are right around a policy discontinuity. So blue bars pay a much higher tax than red bars. And so people who were at a location where there's a blue bar would have wanted to move their vehicle by spending money to improve the vehicle. And so our test for whether or not the automakers have responded is to ask, essentially, are there more red bars than blue bars? And the answer is yes. So hopefully that you see that with your eyes. Statistically, that is a very significant difference as well. And so what we conclude is that automakers are actually manipulating fuel economy at the 0.1 mile per gallon level in response to these incentives. And we've actually talked to them, and they described how they do it, which is, and often they're spending hundreds of dollars per car to make a very small improvement that has almost a negligible impact on any of the externalities we care about. Okay. So a different way of showing the same phenomenon is actually to show the phase-in of the gas guzzler tax. So what this is a histogram of vehicles getting below 22.5 miles per gallon back in 1978. This is before we had a gas guzzler tax. What is also shown in this diagram are a bunch of blue lines. This is where the gas guzzler tax, which phased in, will be in future years. Okay? So the points on the x-axis are going to stay constant. I'm going to show you several different years. Okay, so in 1978 there was no tax. You don't see any obvious relationship between the histogram and the blue bars. In 1979 there was no tax. You don't see any obvious relationship. But what's going to happen is that in 1980 this first point becomes the gas guzzler tax. So any car to the left of this line will have to pay a tax, and any car to the right of this line will not have to pay a tax, starting in 1980. So again, compared to 1979, there's no tax. There's a number of vehicles over in this range. Almost all of them are gone in the year in which the tax took effect. And then going from 1980 to 1981, the minimum tax moved from this line to this line. And so there were a number of cars here, and when I move the standard, all of those cars disappear. The same thing happens the next year, and again. Okay, so what you see is that there is a micro response of the automakers to this one single very sharp incentive, and so they're spending a lot of money improving the fuel economy of these particular set of vehicles, presumably to some extent ignoring or investing less in vehicles that are less directly incentivized. Okay? So that's fine if those are the vehicles that were actually where the improvement in fuel economy could be had with the lowest cost, but there's no reason to presume that. Okay? So this same distortion actually is embedded implicitly in the fuel economy label ratings that you see when you go to buy a car on the lot. The reason is that by law, the fuel economy ratings that are on cars are integers. Okay? And so if a vehicle gets 29.49 miles per gallon on its highway rating, by law, the automaker has to tell you that the fuel economy is 29. And only 29. They're not allowed to even tell you the decimal points on the car label. It's very strictly regulated. But if they could change that so they got 29.5, then it would round up and they could tell you that the fuel economy was 30. Okay? So what we did is we plotted for all vehicles for the last couple of decades their fuel economy rating decimal points. So we went back and reconstructed the unrounded numbers and can show you that there are quite a few more vehicles that end with a 0.5 than with a 0.4, where you'd have to round down. Okay, so again, these are so automakers are spending money to make improvements here, which have almost negligible impact on the externalities we care about. Okay, so my next favorite notch or discontinuity of this type is the difference between passenger cars and light trucks. So my favorite example of a light truck in the United States currently is this vehicle, the PT Cruiser, which is not a car for regulatory purposes, but instead is a light truck. Okay? It is so close to the threshold of being a car instead of a light truck that the convertible PT Cruiser is a car, but the hardtop is a light truck. Okay? So what is a light truck? Well, it turns out if you actually go and look up the federal regulatory code on the definition of a light-duty truck, there are some weight requirements, and then it tells you that a light truck is a vehicle primarily used for transportation of property or a vehicle derived from such a vehicle. Okay, so what that says is a truck is a truck or a vehicle derived from a truck. Okay, and so in the end, what this has typically meant is that anything built on a chassis taken from a previous model of a truck can then be called a truck for regulatory purposes. Okay, so if you've noticed over the years a slight rise in the clearance of what looks like passenger cars, the reason is this regulation. Okay, so the other way to qualify as a light truck, this one's about cargo vans basically. The other way to qualify is to have features that enable off-street or off-highway operation and use. So literally, this is the extent of the definition in the regulatory code. So if you have features that allow you to take your vehicle off-road, then and use it as such, then you can call it a light truck. Okay. So virtually everything out there in the market these days called a crossover, every station wagon is a light truck. Everything called a crossover is a light truck. For some perspective, when we had at the beginning of the CAFE system, we had 12% of the fleet were light trucks, and in 2004, 50% of the cars sold in the United States qualified as light trucks by regulation. Yes? It doesn't have to meet the off-highway if it is. It does not have to meet all of these criteria. It has to meet one, and so it is derived apparently from some previous truck model. And so apparently, so I've never actually gotten in one to check this, but I've been told that one of the things that was important is that the PT Cruiser seats in the back can lay all the way vertical. They can lay all the way flat, and this is important because they claim that's the truck bed. Okay, so it was designed, there's some truck they can claim is the ancestor of the PT Cruiser. One of the signs of that lineage is the fact that if you go in the back and you fold the seats all the way down, you've got a truck bed so you can put your lumber in it, I'm sure, which is, I suspect, relatively rare use of the PT Cruiser. Okay, but also, by the way, if you've seen a lot of PT Cruisers in rental car lots, part of the reason is that they're extremely efficient light trucks, according to the standard. So when Chrysler sells more PT Cruisers, they can sell more heavy cars because they're raising their CAFE standard with it. Okay, so what I've drawn here, let me just check something to think about how much time I have. Okay. What I've drawn here is actually a diagram showing the fuel economy rating of vehicles versus their curb weight, which is one of several sort of metrics of vehicle attribute for two different time periods. And first, in 1984, are the red sort of square data points. The size of them is proportional to the sales of the different models. And the black line shows sort of the trade-off in 1984 between curb weight and fuel economy. So as the vehicle's curb weight goes up, the fuel economy goes down. That's why you have a negative slope of that relationship. So that's sort of like a technology frontier. Between 1984 and 2004, when I had the blue dots, you can see that technology frontier has shifted out significantly. What I want to show you in this diagram, though, is that these two red lines are the location of the top gas guzzler tax in each of those 2 years. And what I've plotted here are just the passenger cars. Okay? So if you looked at this diagram, between 1984 and then 20 years later, there was a change in the gas guzzler tax. And what you can see is that there was a shift upward in the fuel economy frontier for all vehicles. So a vehicle the same curb weight could be more efficient because technology has improved. But it looks like there's a significant amount of reaction to the exact location of the gas guzzler tax point. Okay? And these are just for passenger cars. light trucks, so if you looked at this, you might say the gas guzzler tax should actually move to the fuel economy distribution of vehicles substantially. Okay? Light trucks do not pay the gas guzzler tax. Only cars do. The exemption and the actual preferential treatment goes all the way back to the perceived wisdom in the 70s that light trucks were being used by business people and farmers, and we didn't want to hurt them. We wanted to hurt people who were driving to and from work, not people who were driving as a form of work. So if we plot instead the same diagram, including both the light trucks and the cars, any sense of that change in distribution goes away. There doesn't appear to be anything sharp. There's no sharp break in the overall set of cars at these gas guzzler points. It's only the definition of things called passenger cars, not all vehicles. Okay? So I think of this as suggestive evidence that one of the long-term ways that the automakers have responded is to find ways of taking a car that a consumer wants for certain attributes and transforming it into a light truck for regulatory purposes. Okay, so this part of the story, the big pieces of this are the decline of the station wagon in lieu and being replaced by the minivan, and sort of like the decline of the large sedan, which has been replaced by SUVs and now crossovers. Okay, I'm running short on time, so let me make just one more point here and then wrap up. I had two more points to make. I want to make one, though, quickly. Because the actual gasoline consumed by a vehicle is equal to its miles driven divided by its fuel economy when the fuel economy is written as miles per gallon, it means that the relationship between fuel savings and increases in fuel economy is nonlinear. This is proven to be very confusing to consumers when people have tested it in a lab, and it means that a 1 mile per gallon increase in fuel economy is actually worth less for high efficiency vehicles. The difference is actually quite striking. What I've plotted here is the lifetime gallons of gasoline saved from improving a vehicle by 1 mile per gallon, depending on its starting fuel economy value. Okay? So the way to think about this is that a Chevy Silverado, which gets about 16 miles per gallon, if I improve that by 1 mile per gallon, it would save 500 gallons of gasoline over its lifetime, given assumptions about how much it's driven. In sharp contrast, if I take the Toyota Prius, which was rated at 55 miles per gallon by the EPA, and increase its fuel economy by 1 mile per gallon, I get only about a 50 gallon change in gasoline consumed over its life. This is a 10-fold difference. Okay? I actually had to improve the fuel economy of the Prius by 16 miles per gallon to match the fuel savings from a 1 mile per gallon increase in trucks, in a Chevy Silverado in particular. Okay? So this is actually very important because the way we end up presenting information to consumers tends to obscure this relationship, and we have evidence that consumers make the opposite mistake, and they think about savings as being linear, when in fact they are not. Okay, so I had a couple of other things. If I had time, I was going to mention, but let me just jump to a summary so I don't hold people over who have other obligations. I'm happy to stay afterwards and talk after this, but my summary of all of this goes as follows. There's lots of cars, as I've said, and they cause many important externalities. Economists believe that a gasoline tax is a pretty good solution to all of these, and that a very simple additional tax on congestion makes it nearly perfect. But fuel economy regulation turns out to be a relatively poor substitute for a gas tax. And fuel economy taxation, this idea of taxing or subsidizing new vehicles according to their fuel economy, turns out to be very similar to regulation in terms of its costs and benefits. Okay? So fuel economy policy, as we practice it, does work in the sense that it absolutely increases fuel economy in the market. There's no doubt that these policies have an impact. The trouble is we think that they're much more costly than is necessary to achieve that impact. Okay? And so I haven't talked about this, but the traditional answer as soon as an economist starts talking about a gas tax is that everyone says, stop talking about it, it's politically infeasible, tell me about something else. So even if that is the case, I hope what I showed you in the second half is that even if you don't believe we can move from the system we have now to a completely different system where we're taxing the fuels directly because of politics, it's still the case that we could make lots of improvements in the way we tax and regulate fuel economy because of the distortions that I was trying to show you there at the end. All of these things are things that we don't actually have to have. We don't have to have a light car or a light truck passenger car distinction. We don't have to have notches in these policies that create these distortions. These are things that we could smooth away without having to make a paradigm shift in our policy. And the last thing I want to leave you with is to know that these types of notches and those problems are not unique to fuel economy. So we have these types of issues arise, and I'm doing some preliminary work showing that the type of behavioral response of producers exists in markets for Energy Star ratings, which are just an on-off rating, and LEED certification points, where you can see you need exactly a number of points to qualify for each level of LEED certification. And it's also true of sort of any minimum efficiency regulation, which happens to be how we do most environmental regulation in this country. Okay, so that is my take on sort of the base economic view of fuel economy policy. So thank you very much.
Like if those speakers, people need to leave, please feel free to do that. But does someone have a question you'd like to ask?
I was curious about thinking about the chart that we gave, the Gaudian tax chart. So it seemed like it was a static offset for the tax, $1 you mentioned.
Yep.
Well, why is it not a percentage base of percentage of cost?
So the way we usually think about this is that if we can put a dollar value on the per gallon of gasoline consumed or per mile driven of the car, if we can put a dollar amount on that, then it actually doesn't matter. If we can put a dollar amount on that in terms of the externality, it doesn't matter what the cost of gasoline is. That externality is the same size. So you could think about that diagram. If the externality is the difference between those two lines, if I shift it up or down the actual private supply curve, the externality, as long as the externality is the same size, then the red line would just move up and down in tandem with it, which means that you want a per unit tax, not like an ad valorem tax.
Okay, so it's not making revenue. The point is not to make revenue. The point is
That's
not
right.
How much can you squeeze out of me?
That's right.
Percentage-wise, the point is getting rid of the health issues.
It's pricing the damages that are outside the market. Yeah. Yes. Either one of you.
So taking off on that is maybe more of a political question, but so where do we suspect that dollar would go? So right now the 40 cents goes to specific funds. This dollar has the idea is to drive down the number of miles driven, gasoline use. Where would we put that?
So again, as a public economist, my answer is that it goes to general revenue and that I don't care, that I don't think we should be earmarking things. Now, is that a good answer about what would actually happen in the government? Perhaps not. So maybe a guide to answering that question. I don't have a lot of insight about that specifically, but a guide to answering that question might be to ask sort of what we were going to do with carbon tax, or I guess it was cap and trade revenue from auctioning off some portion of permits under sort of like the Waxman-Markey bill, for example. And the answer was that we had a very complicated pie chart of who we were paying off. So a political scientist might offer you the answer that maybe we'd use that dollar to pay off people who are hurt by the policy. A good example would be if you gave back a lump sum amount to low-income consumers, for example, because a gasoline tax would be regressive. So it would actually have a bigger impact as a percentage of overall consumption or income of low-income households. We know this for sure. You can just plot the relationship between income and the fraction of income spent on gasoline. It's a very striking gradient. So we might want to use some of that revenue. Don't give it back to people in direct relationship to how much gasoline they consume, because that would undo the incentive. But you could give it back to people by, for example, one common way to talk about this is reducing the payroll tax, which is a very progressive way of cutting taxes on labor that would give money back to low-income people. That's more of like a normative answer on what I think we ought to do with it, is either just use it, forget about it think of it as general revenue, or target it to lump sum rebates to low-income people. I don't have a positive view of like what I think would happen to the revenue. Yeah.
Well, I'm interested that your answer didn't contain that it should be directed to increasing mass transit, especially on the equity issue, the declining curve of increasing gas tax on lower income.
Hey, I don't have any objection to moving it towards mass transit. But again, I mean, it's not necessarily a better targeted way to, if you're just worried about the equity implications, to put it towards mass transit. It's probably better targeted. Perhaps, yeah. Yeah. Yes.
So I'm a little confused about the policy objective here. Is it to reduce the amount of gasoline? Is it to get cars off the road? If you looked at your externality cost that you mentioned as examples, it seemed like it had a little bit of both, but then it was being tacked on to the gasoline price, and so that's left me a little confused there.
Yeah, so I'm not sure which aspect you're referring to, but if you're thinking about like the $1 number that I put up earlier,
Well,
that...
I think you talked about congestion and accidents, which to me would be more related to the number of cars on the road.
That's right. So
say gasoline.
yeah, so I was calling that miles driven. I think of that as miles driven. So it's not the number of cars in garages, it's the number of cars on the road. So that can either come from having fewer cars sold or from having cars that exist driven less.
The gasoline price, because that seems like if you're worried about gasoline and greenhouse gas emissions and so on and so forth.
So the ideal is to tax both the gasoline and miles driven. So there are ways that people have been talking about this. So for reasons not related to greenhouse gases or any of these externalities, but instead related to state revenue, people have been talking about doing odometer taxes, where at the end of the year you have to show your odometer to someone when you register your car each year, and that the amount you pay is dependent on the number of miles you've driven in the last year. We also have the technology to put things in cars to monitor how many miles you drive. Monitoring exactly where you are with like a GPS system is not a real popular thing in the United States. People are not big on that sort of the government knowing these types of things. Although apparently Apple knows where I am at all times. We learned this week. So they know how many miles I've been driving. But yeah, so the ideal is to do both. And if you can't do the mileage tax, you can't tax congestion for whatever reason, just policy-wise, or it's not feasible or something, then that influences how much you want to tax gasoline, because that's a sort of, taxing gasoline is a coarse way of taxing mileage. It's just, we would much rather tax mileage and gasoline because there's two sets of externalities. Each one can be targeted precisely with two policies.
And what about the cost associated? Let's assume that you do get a reduction, let's say, in the number of vehicles sold. That has a little effect on the economy in terms of jobs and
Yes.
other sectors.
That's right.
And so on and so forth. Where are those at?
So in the long run, those are not social costs because, so an economist has a cheap answer to that, which is that in the long run, those are not social costs because what it means is we were producing too many cars relative to the social optimum in the first place. Okay, so that's actually, if you live in Michigan, you're not impressed by that answer, I suspect. So and even an economist would say, there are transition costs which we're experiencing between, workers needing to be able to move between sectors over the long run. There are short-run costs that are substantial, which are not being accounted for in that number. Yeah.
Do the studies on externalities take into account things like durability? In other words, replacing metal parts for latches and things with cheap plastic that breaks, or bumpers that don't bump, or
the big one that I think is related is that people study the safety. So this is actually controversial whether or not CAFE makes cars more or less safe. And that has to do more than materials or lightweighting of vehicles that you might be describing. It tends to have more to do with just the size of the car overall, its curb weight. And so the literature on that is actually unsettled, I would say. But the estimates that I find more credible actually show fatality risk goes up on net, even accounting for the impact on other people and yourself when you lightweight your cars. But how that all plays out is actually in an equilibrium that's actually not obvious.
I was thinking more in terms of what it costs to fix a car that gets hit on a big ceramic panel as opposed to a dent that you could punch out.
That's good. I'm not sure that that's being accounted for. It's an interesting dimension. Yeah.
gas tax is probably the simplest way of talking about this thing. In the U.S., it's a kind of a cross on which to crucify politicians, but certainly throughout Europe and in Canada, for that matter, historically, gas tax has been enormous compared to the United States. It's got to have been successfully justified in social terms. That apparently haven't been successful.
Yeah, so so one thing I would say is important about that is my cursory understanding of the history of gas taxes in much of the rest of the world is, again, gas taxes were not based on making an environmental case to the society. It was based on deciding that they were going to have lower income taxes and raise more of their money through taxes on fuel. And they're just going to raise a lot of revenue that way. But the differences are vast. And actually the impact of very high gasoline taxes in places like the UK, where the gas tax is something like $2.80 a gallon equivalent, is significant. You see the difference in the stock of vehicles that have been produced and driven there in the long run. They have smaller cars. It's not just because London has narrow streets.
But you see the difference in mass transit.
Yep. Yeah, well, I agree. It's difficult to disentangle what might cause differences in mass transit, but yes, agreed. It's a little bit sharper to look at the gas because you can actually see the difference in the diesel stock of passenger cars in Europe. Partly has to do with particulate standards in the U.S. that kept a lot of diesels out here for a long time, but also a lot to do with the fact that they have places with very high gas taxes tend to have much lower diesel taxes because they're worried about raising the cost of commercial transport too much, and that's a large driver over time. And you can see the correlation even within Europe across countries and how many diesel passenger cars they have driving around relative to gasoline cars has a lot to do with that relative ratio. Yeah.
So this might be a policy question, but obviously people who are driving all-electric cars or compressed natural gas cars are paying no motor fuel tax whatsoever right now, and that's all being carried by the people who are driving gas guzzlers. To some lesser extent, the guy with the fuel-efficient car in his driveway pays less tax than his neighbor with the Yukon. There's going to be some kind of policy change to take in those CNG cars and electric.
Yeah.
What do we expect that to look like?
Well, since I'm mostly actually worried about climate change, I've got an easy answer to that, which is that we don't actually need a gas tax to solve climate change policy. We just need a carbon tax, which would also raise the price of gasoline, further upstream. It would also capture the carbon in the natural gas vehicles or in any other fuel or electric vehicles if we had an economy-wide carbon tax. So that's my simple answer to that. If you were worried about getting the revenue, sort of raising a portion out of those vehicles, then you're going to have an ad hoc patch that taxes those vehicles some amount. And you can just change the registration fees for state and local things and capture that probably. But it's not something I've thought about.
Are there any questions? Okay,